Imagine this. You are standing in a vast, pristine land. The year is 1492. The wind carries the scent of pine and salt. You are not a king, not a conqueror, not a name that will ever be etched into a monument. You are one of the original people of this place we now call the Americas. You have no word for private property. You have no concept of a king. You have lived here for thousands of years, and the earth has provided for you like a mother provides for a child. You watch the horizon, and you see something you have never seen before. Strange, massive wooden structures floating on the sea, carrying men with skin the color of ashen metal strapped to their bodies. Now, imagine this. You are sitting in a classroom, roughly 500 years later. The air is thick with the smell of chalk dust and floor wax. A teacher stands at the front of the room, drawing a timeline on the board. You see the names: Columbus, the Pilgrims, George Washington, Abraham Lincoln. The dates are crisp, the battles are clean, and the narrative is a smooth, unbroken line pointing toward progress, toward freedom, toward greatness. You are told this is your heritage. You are told this is the story of America. Here is the paradox Howard Zinn drops like a depth charge into the calm waters of that narrative. What if both of these moments are true, but only one of them ever got written down? A people's history of the United States doesn't just ask you to question what you know. It asks you to question the very act of knowing. It presents a haunting, almost unbearable tension. The tension between the story a nation tells about itself to survive and the reality its people live through to survive. Zinn opens the book not with a declaration of independence, but with the collision of two worlds viewed from the deck of the Nina, the Pinta, and the Santa Maria, and from the shore. He forces you to look at the cheering crowds and the burning villages simultaneously. The book operates on a single radical premise: that the heroes of your textbooks were not heroes to everyone. That the progress celebrated in monuments was paid for with currency you can't find in a wallet. Paid in blood, in tears, in stolen land, in stolen labor. Zinn asks a question so simple, it's devastating. Whose history are we reading? He argues that history is not an objective collection of facts, drifting in the ether waiting to be collected. It is a selection. It is a story told by the victors, the powerful, the ones who built the libraries and named the streets. But what happens when you stop looking at the nation from the top of the pyramid and start looking at it from the base? What happens when you stop asking what the generals did and start asking what the deserters did? What happens when you stop celebrating the presidents and start listening to the slaves, the women, the striking workers, the indigenous people who watched their world sink below the horizon? This is not a history book. This is a key to a locked door in the back of your own mind, the door marked with the questions you were trained not to ask. Why does power always look noble in the retelling? Why does dissent always look like treason in its own time and patriotism later? And if the story you were told about the past is a carefully curated lie, what does that say about the story you're being told about the present? Zinn doesn't just invite you to step through that door. He pushes you. And on the other side, you don't find answers. You find a mirror. If this perspective is already challenging everything you thought you knew, hit that like button, because we're only getting started, and the truth gets harder to ignore from here. Subscribe now, because in our next video, we'll be dissecting another book that the powers that be don't want you to read. And you won't want to miss what's coming. You've felt it, haven't you? That nagging suspicion that the story you were sold doesn't quite match the reality you inhabit. That the gleaming monuments in the town square cast shadows longer than they should. Howard Zinn diagnosed this dissonance not as a failure of memory, but as a deliberate architecture, a system designed to manufacture forgetfulness. Here's the hidden problem Zinn excavates from beneath 2 centuries of patriotic sediment. History is not memory. It is permission. The author reveals that the problem isn't simply that history is written by the winners. It's that the winners write history to make their winning seem inevitable, natural, even moral. Zinn calls this the mountaintop perspective, the view from the commanding heights where decisions look clean, wars look noble, and suffering looks like the necessary price of progress. But he spends 400 pages dragging you down into the valleys where the actual living and dying happened. Consider Columbus. The textbooks frame him as a visionary navigator, a man of courage who discovered America. But Zinn forces you to sit with Columbus's own diary entries, the ones describing how his men took native children by force to be sold as slaves, how they used dogs to hunt down those who fled, how they cut off the hands of indigenous people who failed to bring enough gold. These weren't footnotes lost to time. They were recorded. They were known. They were simply omitted from the story we chose to tell ourselves about ourselves. Why? Because the myth of Columbus served a purpose. It sanctified the entire project of conquest. If Columbus was heroic, then the genocide that followed was merely the tragic but unavoidable consequence of bringing civilization to savages. The narrative laundered the blood. Zinn diagnoses this as the fundamental machinery of power, the control of narrative. Every empire, every government, every dominant class understands that physical control is temporary. People rebel. People resist. But if you can control the story, if you can make people believe that the way things are is the way things must be, that the powerful earned their position and the powerless deserve theirs, then you don't need armies. You need only textbooks. This connects to something the philosopher Michel Foucault would later call power, knowledge, the idea that what a society accepts as truth is itself a product of power relations. But Zinn goes deeper, more visceral. He shows you the whip marks on the backs of enslaved women, the frozen bodies of striking workers shot in the streets, the children coughing themselves to death in textile mills. The problem isn't abstract. It's carved into flesh. And here's where it gets personal. You've internalized this narrative. We all have. You carry within you a version of American history that was curated specifically to make you trust authority, to make you skeptical of protest, to make you believe that change happens only through approved channels and that rebellion is always reckless. Every time you felt that instinctive discomfort with someone burning a flag or blocking a street, you felt the weight of that curated history pressing down on your nervous system. Zinn's diagnosis is this: you have been colonized, not just territorially, but cognitively. The conquest didn't end when the guns fell silent. It continued in the stories you were told about who mattered and who didn't, who built and who merely labored, who spoke for the nation and who was spoken about. The consequences of this hidden problem? They aren't in some textbook. They're in the way you think right now, in this moment, reading these words. And unless you understand the depth of the conditioning, you'll never be free of it. The problem isn't that you don't know enough history. The problem is that the history you know was designed to keep you from knowing yourself. Look around you right now. The world you inhabit, the jobs available, the wages paid, the neighborhoods segregated, the wars fought in your name. Every contour of this reality was carved by the hidden problems Zinn exposed. The consequences aren't abstract historical footnotes. They are the walls of the room you're standing in. Here is the first consequence. You have been taught to see rebellion as pathology. Zinn dedicates entire chapters to the resistance that textbook history buries. The enslaved people who poisoned their masters, earned crops, fled by the thousands. The women who organized boycotts, chained themselves to railings, starved themselves in prisons. The workers who occupied factories, fought militias, died on picket lines. These weren't marginal figures. They were millions. But in the official story, they become footnotes, troublemakers, agitators, outliers. Why does this matter? Because when you see rebellion only as disruption, you never recognize it as the engine of every human right you possess. The 8-hour workday? It didn't arrive through the kindness of industrialists. It arrived through strikes so massive that troops had to be called in, through bombs planted in Haymarket Square, through bodies piled in the streets. Women's suffrage won through decades of organizing, imprisonment, force-feeding of hunger strikers. The weekend, a concession to a labor movement that threatened to shut down the entire economy. Every freedom you take for granted was once considered treason. But because the history books celebrate only the final outcome, the legislation, the signing ceremony, you never see the blood that fertilized the soil. You grow up believing change happens when good people ask politely. And so you wait, you vote, you sign petitions. You wonder why nothing changes. Second consequence, you have been trained to fear the poor. Zinn traces this thread from the earliest colonial settlements through every major uprising. The wealthy have always understood that a united underclass is an existential threat. So they engineered division. They turned poor whites against enslaved blacks, offering a psychological wage, the comfort of not being at the absolute bottom, in exchange for accepting miserable conditions themselves. They pitted Irish immigrants against free blacks, native-born against foreign, skilled against unskilled. This isn't ancient history. It's the reason your neighborhood looks the way it does. It's the reason political ads can still win elections by stoking fear of some other crossing a border or moving into a community. The elites learned centuries ago that if they could keep the bottom fighting the bottom, the top could sleep soundly. Third consequence, you have been taught that America is essentially good. This is perhaps the deepest cut. The narrative of American exceptionalism, the idea that this nation is uniquely virtuous, a city upon a hill, isn't just patriotic rhetoric. It's a psychological defense mechanism. If America is essentially good, then its violence must be accidental. Its imperialism must be benevolent. Its inequalities must be aberrations rather than features. Zinn demolishes this by showing pattern, not exception. From the extermination of indigenous peoples to the conquest of the Philippines, from the bombing of civilians in Vietnam to the funding of death squads in Central America, the violence isn't a departure from American values. It's the execution of them. The goal was always resources, always control, always profit. The lofty language was just the packaging. And here's the consequence that lands in your lap. You live in a society designed to make you feel powerless. If history is a series of inevitable events guided by wise leaders, then your role is to consume, to comply, to cheer when told. But if history is what Zinn reveals, a constant, brutal, beautiful struggle between the few who hoard power and the many who fight for dignity, then your role changes. Then you are not a spectator. You are a participant. You are the continuation of a story that began before you were born and will continue after you're gone. The stakes couldn't be higher. Because if you continue seeing yourself as powerless, you will remain so. And the architects of this system, the ones who wrote the textbooks you read, are counting on exactly that. If your mind is still processing what we just uncovered, drop a comment below with the one historical event you suspect you were never taught the full truth about. We read every single one. Subscribe and turn on notifications, because the next section reveals the path forward. And after seeing how deep the problem runs, you won't want to miss how Zinn says we fight back. You've sat with the diagnosis. You've felt the weight of the consequences. The world looks different now, darker, perhaps, but also more honest. And now the question rises in your throat like bile. What do we do? If the story is a lie, if the system is rigged, if power always launders its crimes through narrative, then where is the exit? Howard Zinn doesn't offer a 10-step program. He doesn't hand you a voting guide or a manifesto. Instead, he offers something far more radical, a redefinition of hope itself. Here is the prescription, distilled from 400 years of resistance. Progress is not inevitable. It is not linear. It is not delivered by saviors. Progress is what happens when ordinary people refuse to stay in the place assigned to them. Zinn calls this the power of the powerless, a phrase that sounds like a contradiction until you watch it operate in history. He shows you the enslaved woman who runs away, knowing she might be caught, knowing she might be killed, but running anyway because the act of refusal is itself a victory. He shows you the striking worker who stands in front of a militia's rifles, not because he believes he will win that day, but because he believes his children might. He shows you the anti-war protester who is beaten, arrested, mocked, and who returns the next day. This is not the hope of eventual triumph. This is the hope of dignity in the present tense. Zinn draws from a deep well of philosophical insight here. He echoes Albert Camus, who wrote that the struggle itself toward the heights is enough to fill a man's heart. He channels the Stoics, who understood that you cannot control outcomes, but you can control your response. But Zinn democratizes this wisdom. He takes it out of the philosopher's study and places it in the streets, in the fields, in the factories where people have always fought back, not because they were guaranteed victory, but because fighting back was the only way to remain human. The author's prescription has 3 movements. First, see clearly. This is the foundation of everything. You must strip away the narratives designed to pacify you. You must look at your country, your history, your leaders with unblinking eyes. See the gap between what they say and what they do. See the bodies beneath the monuments. See the prophets behind the policies. This is not cynicism. This is clarity, and clarity is the prerequisite for action. Second, act locally. Think historically. Zinn is suspicious of grand gestures, of waiting for the perfect revolution, of leaders who promise to liberate you. Real change, he shows, happens in the spaces where people organize around what they can actually affect. The union local, the tenant association, the neighborhood mutual aid network. These are the laboratories of dignity. They don't make headlines, but they make history. Third, accept the long game. This is perhaps the hardest pill. Zinn quotes the abolitionist Wendell Phillips. Eternal vigilance is the price of liberty, but he deepens it. He shows that the abolitionists didn't live to see emancipation. The suffragists didn't all live to vote. The labor organizers died on picket lines decades before the 40-hour week. They fought knowing they might never taste the fruit. They fought because the fight itself was the point. Here is the metaphor Zinn leaves you with. Imagine history as a vast tapestry. The powerful weave their threads, golden, prominent, impossible to miss. But beneath them, holding the entire thing together, are millions of invisible threads. The ones who resisted, the ones who said no, the ones who passed down stories of rebellion when rebellion was punished by death. You cannot see them from a distance, but without them, the tapestry unravels. You are one of those threads now. You didn't ask for this, but the diagnosis has been delivered, the consequences named, and the prescription written. The only question remaining is whether you will continue to let history happen to you, or whether you will finally, fully become its author. You've traveled through the wreckage. You've stood on the shore with the dying and in the classroom with the indoctrinated. You've felt the weight of the diagnosis and the fragile hope of the prescription. And now, as the final pages turn, Howard Zinn asks you to sit with the most unsettling question of all. What if the entire framework is wrong? Not the facts. The facts are immutable. The bodies buried, the treaties broken, the strikes crushed. But the framework, the way we've been trained to think about power, progress, and possibility itself. Here's the book's ultimate truth, delivered not as argument, but as revelation. The powerful are not powerful because they deserve to be. They are powerful because we have been taught to believe they are. This is not a slogan. This is a philosophical dismantling of everything you've been told about how the world works. Zinn spends 400 pages showing you that kings, presidents, generals, and CEOs do not possess some mystical quality that elevates them above the rest of humanity. They possess armies, yes. They possess wealth, certainly. But more than anything, they possess the narrative. They possess the story that says their power is natural, necessary, eternal. And stories, unlike armies, can be rewritten. Zinn's final synthesis is this: citizenship is not a status granted by the state. It is a practice enacted by the people. The Constitution didn't give you rights. People demanding rights gave the Constitution meaning. The Declaration of Independence didn't create equality. People struggling for equality forced the Declaration to echo through centuries. The documents are just paper. The monuments are just stone. What gives them life, what gives them truth, is the living, breathing, bleeding insistence of ordinary humans that they matter. This is the paradigm shift Zinn intends. You close this book not with a new set of facts to deploy in arguments, but with a new set of eyes to see the world. You walk down your street and you no longer see just buildings and businesses. You see the strikes that won the weekend. You see the organizing that banned child labor. You see the rebellions that turned fire hoses on children, and in doing so, turned a nation's stomach. The history you weren't taught is written everywhere, in the cracks of the sidewalk, in the faded union signs on old factories, in the names of streets that honor men who owned other humans. And here is the final poetic truth. You are not reading history. You are continuing it. Every moment of your life is a choice between compliance and resistance, between the story you were given and the story you will live. When you see injustice and look away, you are writing a sentence in someone's future history book, a sentence about how people in your time accepted the unacceptable. When you speak, when you organize, when you refuse, you are writing a different sentence, a sentence about the ones who fought back. Zinn ends not with triumph, but with invitation. He quotes the abolitionist Theodore Parker, whose words would later be stolen and smoothed by Martin Luther King Jr. The arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends toward justice. But Zinn adds the crucial context. The arc bends, yes, but it does not bend on its own. It bends because millions of hands, generation after generation, reach up and pull it down toward the earth. It bends because people like you decide that the story is not finished, that the last chapter has not been written, that the final word belongs not to the powerful, but to the powerless who refuse to stay in their place. So here you are. The book is closed. The screen is dark. The world is waiting. The question is no longer what Howard Zinn believed. The question is what you will do. The history they didn't teach you is now yours. And what you make of it, what you make of yourself within it, is the only story that has ever truly mattered.